You're listening to the Our Erie podcast with Davona Pacley,
Marty Nwachukwu, and Lydia Laythe.
This series will bring citizens, entrepreneurs, activists, politicians, artists, and thought leaders to the table for a frank discussion around societal issues facing our post-industrial city and the United States at large. Take a seat.
All right. So you're here with Our Erie. We have a very exciting guest with us,
Yes.
Dr. Jolie. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yes.
So would you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do?
Sure. So first, thank you all for having me. It's a real pleasure. I am assistant professor of anthropology at Mercyhurst University. I grew up in Southern Maryland, but my family connections are largely out west. I am an enrolled citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma, but also of Oglala Lakota or Sioux descent with family from South Dakota. I got into archaeology at a young age, largely historical archaeology, where I grew up in Southern Maryland. And it wasn't really until college that it sort of coalesced into a firm recognition that what I wanted to do was use archaeology in a positive, more applied way. It wasn't something that I was aware you could do. And so that sort of guided a lot of the ways that I've engaged my discipline since then. Went to graduate school out west, spent time in Nevada and in New Mexico. And a lot of my research and research interests focus not just on Native American anthropologist relationships and ethical practice within anthropology, but also looking at bigger issues of social identities, population movement, migration, and what the sort of connections are from the archaeological and anthropological evidence to contemporary Native American and other populations. And I tend to do this by focusing on a class of material culture of artifacts that are generally referred to as perishable artifacts. These are organic artifacts that don't typically survive in a lot of archaeological contexts, in contrast to a lot of archaeologists who study stone tools or human remains or ceramic technology. And in addition to being a really sort of rare, uncommon technology, it's also something that I think has sort of unique potential for allowing us to get these rare glimpses of the past, given that when you look cross-culturally, the vast majority of the material culture, things that people made and used on a day-to-day basis in many small-scale and traditional societies is made from organic materials. It's textiles, baskets, it's hide work, it's feather work. But when you consider that the vast majority of that does not preserve any archaeological record, we lack that evidence. And so I like to think about, there's some good studies that show, in most archaeological contexts, you're getting largely stone, maybe even limited bone preservation. When we have really good preservational context, so environmental extremes, extremely wet, extremely dry, extremely cold, where organic preservation is likely to be greater, we find that upwards of 90% of the artifacts that are found and recovered are made of organic materials. So on the one hand, it's kind of striking that archaeologists are able to extract so much about the past history of the human experience on our planet, spanning at least 2.5 million years, from just stone tools and some limited bone tools. But it's also really scary that we're only doing that from 10% of what's available. Yes. So I'm a big fan of organic material culture, of the baskets, textiles, and that's largely influenced how I approach archaeological research, but it's become more recently a necessary intersection with work I'm interested in doing with contemporary tribal communities and tribal nations.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. Wow. Holy smokes. Lots of good information there. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm interested to hear about, because some context for what we talk about a lot on this podcast, we've probably almost every episode talked about racism or, systemic issues, policy level issues. And obviously by our demographic makeup, we tend to talk more about like black and white racism and racial dynamics, historically and currently. And so we were really excited to open this conversation. Maybe you can just help us and we can all, talk just about, broadening that into, what does that look like, in regards to what you said about social identity too, that how can we expand our conversations about racism and systemic racism, systemic oppression, historical trauma, and include more people in that conversation, or how do you see your work fitting into that conversation?
I guess so. Kind of two parts to that. One is that, on the one hand, I think concepts like intersectionality, that when people talk about different aspects and different types of social identities that are scaled to both the individual and different social groupings, influence how individuals identify, or perhaps for how they enact or perform an identity in a given circumstance or context. There are some that, depending on context, depending what's out in popular or public discourse, tend to be accentuated or heightened. And I don't offer that as either a positive or a negative, but rather to say that it's simply the way that things develop, the way that they emerge organically from public discourse. And that there are, when we think about that concept of intersectionality in these different types of scales, social identities, there are lots of other types of identities that can be, depending on context or situation or historical circumstance, be diminished or marginalized. And I think it's an odd, if also as an anthropologist, an interesting thing to have attempted to approach sort of some of these identity constructions from an anthropological perspective, having the benefit of sort of being able to reflect on my own experiences as what my mother called us, transplanted Indians, growing up in Southern Maryland when I was a kid, where there was not much of a very active or vocal Native American community. Now, let's say that there aren't Native Americans in Maryland. That's certainly the case, that there are. But it was a very different sort of upbringing than you could contrast with my mother growing up in her early years on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, with her father and traveling around with her mother, who was Creek and a social worker. And, obviously times have changed dramatically since the 50s and 60s, but we also find ourselves in a position where we continue to find ourselves baffled, flummoxed, incredulous at the ways in which other members of society seek to creatively dismiss or erase other identity constructs. And I think that one of the things that has struck me most, and perhaps most starkly, has been the ways in which the Native presence in Erie and Pennsylvania generally has been so diminished and is never talked about. And part of this is a consequence of just historical context, historical circumstance that got us where we are today. But it also reflects sort of, I think, wider sort of public issues with how Indians are viewed and conceived. Now, I say this recognizing that, in the last few months, they finally decided to change the name of the Washington football team, which I'd sort of given up. I just thought, no, it's not going to go away. And again, I grew up in Maryland. That was, that my household was a fan of that team, despite the fact that was, it's not a really popular term. But, the Cleveland Indians are now going to change their name. So, I think maybe it's been a really rocky, rough road, but maybe we're on the cusp of something really positive starting in late January of next year. So we'll have to see where things go. But I think it comes back a lot to visibility. People want to be acknowledged. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of positive press and healing that came about from Australia apologizing to Aboriginal populations, from Canada apologizing to the treatment of their indigenous peoples. The U.S., not so much. And so there's a lot of work to be done, obviously on multiple levels to approach these subjects of healing. But I think I like to think of myself as inherently an optimist. So hopefully we're moving in that direction now. But I think the visibility and acknowledgement, being able to speak up and speak truth to power, is probably more important now than ever. And so this is spectacular to have this opportunity to talk more about these issues.
Yeah, I'm grateful to talk about these issues because I think you brought up an important thing for me is like healing. Healing is really important not only with self, but just when we talk about that in our community, if we took responsibility, you know what I'm saying, for the things that happened in the past. And I know a lot of people will sit and say, well, that was in the past, right? We don't need to talk about that. We need to focus on what's going on now. I don't think people understand that a part of healing, a part of growth is acknowledging shit that's happened in the past, and really saying, okay, well, we acknowledge this was what happened. We're acknowledging that people are still here too. And they're visible. We want to make them visible. And I think it's super important to talk about that, because if we can't talk about that, then how are we going to be able to move forward? And that is super important. We're talking about healing of our land, which goes so much more deeper than than I think we acknowledge and realize.
Yeah. It reminds me, like the other day, I was reading another book. Because after I finished Black Indians, which is a book we're reading for like our little book club, my aunt bought me a book called An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Also, 10 out of 10 would recommend. It's by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. It's like right over here. I was just looking at it. But, and I like had to sit there for a second, and I like, especially as a white person too, like I sit here and I think, oh my God, like, how do we fix this?
Mm-hmm.
How do we fix it? Like,
right.
The house that I live in right now is on land that was stolen from people and people that were I have so many thoughts in my head, but like, how do you unpack that? How, like, in conversations about reparations and what we like, the healing that needs to happen for people that were enslaved in the United States, there's also another conversation about reparations for people that were like forcibly like made refugees in their own home too,
and enslaved as well,
right? Shortly, right? But like what we learned too is that like white people couldn't enslave indigenous people, which is why they started just like killing them, because like they were not the good workhorse that they could use. So then like, if you're not gonna make us money, then like you're no good to us, you're not worthy of life, which is like capitalism and white supremacy and all that stuff. But it's huge. I mean, these issues are massive. And how do we fix it? I mean, but yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Healing, talking about it, visibility, that's where we have to start. I mean, this is the first, that like such a small baby step, it feels like to me, is like, and okay, sorry, last thing, and then I'll let other people talk. But also, I'm so disappointed in the Washington football team and Cleveland Indians team, like their responses to changing their names. Like, not too late. It's never too late. But also, like, we've known that this is a problem for a long time, and it's just a freaking name. Like, just change the name. Who cares? I will never understand the United States, particularly white men's obsession with sports and their inability to like understand that it's just a freaking game. Yeah. So the fact that it took so long to change the name, and then even in them saying they're changing the name, I was reading some article about the Cleveland Indians, and they like their statement that they made was like so weak and so like, oh well, you know, we recognize that it's been offensive to some people, and so we want to change it, but we never really meant to hurt people, so it wasn't really like a big deal, but we're changing it just, you know, whatever, but we're not changing it right now because that would be too tough, so like we'll change it later. Like,
it's weird, isn't it? I think though, in general, sports is very touchy too, because sports, as much as we're saying it's just sports is very systemic in its own way. And there's a lot of racism in sports in its own way, but that's a whole other conversation, because
good point.
Yeah, sports, it goes deep. Like we're talking about this conversation, it's sports, it's all a part of the system. So
yeah, well, and bring it back to Erie too, right? Like all these unacknowledged stories in Erie specifically, you know, when we talk about our Erie.
Yeah.
Is it really my Erie? Like, what does our Erie mean? And how do we, you know, talk about that? I mean, I don't even know, Dr. Jolie, are you familiar with any sort of historical markers or memorials or any sort of acknowledgement formally in Erie County or in the city of Erie for the indigenous people that lived here or that live here still?
Geez, I'm sure I'm going to be remiss. I'm going to miss something.
Okay.
But you know, indigenous groups locally do get a nod in some of the local museum exhibits, but it's often presented in a context in which they are sort of relics from the past, and that more or less, if we're lucky, that Indians are a viable agent and actor on the historical scene up until the late 1700s, early 1800s. It's usually at that point after the French Indian War that in Pennsylvania Indians sort of disappear in large numbers. I don't think so, but one of the things that's sort of been nagging at me and has this conversation, your question, Lydia, has really got me think about is that there's actually, I was sort of reviewing the archaeology of what we know about the Erie Indians, the tribe or group of tribes that lived on the southern shores of Lake Erie, and sort of what we understand about them. And there aren't a lot of details, both from the historical record, but also from the archaeological record, because we have the challenge, which is a complicated discussion in and of itself, of how we attempt to connect historical identities, nonetheless contemporary ethno-political identities, to groups that lived in an archaeological past that we don't know through documents or necessarily through oral tradition, and examining the veracity of those claims and about affinity. But there is a site on, I'd have to double check. I want to say it was burials that were excavated in the 20s or 30s at sort of like West 28th in Erie. And I believe the remains, if they still exist and haven't been returned, reburied, are at the State Museum in Pennsylvania. But that would strike me as probably a particularly important place in Erie to strike some form of commemoration. And that may be something worth giving additional thought to, because it's not mentioned in a lot of local public discourse and conversation. I haven't gotten data yet. I haven't looked into what exactly is discussed about local Erie history in the Erie public school system. My daughter's 8 years old, and so she's at an age where we're starting to get into more of those details. And I did have, and she's had great teachers at Jefferson Elementary, just really fabulous teachers. But you do want to sort of cautiously approach those conversations about Thanksgiving and how's this going to go. What is she going to come home saying that someone was talking about, and trying to head that off, but also thinking about ways in which they might present a little bit more local history. And I think it comes back to, my point is that it comes back to some of these bigger issues that you were raising about acknowledgement, that it's just simply acknowledging that people exist, acknowledging that bad shit happened, and we feel bad about it. It can go a long way in terms of healing, because I think most rational-minded individuals recognize, I don't blame the descendants of the people who might have participated in those actions, because that doesn't make sense. That's silly. But some acknowledgement and recognition that they might have benefited from all of those actions that had transpired would help contribute to healing. And also, something as simple as land acknowledgements, which are becoming a lot more common for Native groups and allies, I think is a significant way to do that. And that would be something that would be good to see. I know in Canada, sometimes in places like Toronto, some schools require that there's a land acknowledgement before the Pledge of Allegiance every day. And so I think that small acts like that, apologies, recognition, can go a really long way to healing. But, again, there's this resistance, whether it be a football team or baseball team's name, to these subtle acts. And I think I sort of long struggled with that, both because I remember being younger in Maryland growing up, and one of my friend's parents asked me, how did I feel about the mascot name? And I was like 13 or 14. It wasn't really on my radar. But I remember I guess if they're winning, it's okay. And of course, the Washington football team has never been a really strong football team. And so I've always sort of reflected upon that and thought, what do I make about this? And on the one hand, for a long time, I felt, Indian country has a lot of bigger issues to be worried about. The mascot issue is a sort of on the side. And I think for a lot of people who didn't have the privileged upbringing and experiences and opportunities that I did, it strikes closer to home in more painful ways, because those negative and harmful stereotypes more directly in ways that I can't see, having grown up in Maryland, impact the ways that they grew up and the experiences they had in their childhoods. So I have a great appreciation, having invested more in thinking about these things, having the privilege of the time to think about these things, that they matter a lot in subtle ways. And it's the way that people are sort of socialized, that they're brought up as children, that the way this information is transmitted to them, that if it becomes normalized that to expect that Indians are extinct and dead, then yeah, sure, everything is going to come as a shock or surprise. And of course, that doesn't just apply to Native Americans, but a lot of other groups and experiences generally.
You've been listening to the Our Erie podcast, the voice of reason in the fog of post-industrial America. Next week, tune into our conversation centering around the Zoom culture, social media, and what it means to end racism in our community. If you would like to continue the conversation, visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/Our Erie Series. This podcast is produced by John C. Lyons, Marty Nwachukwu, Davona Pacley, and Lydia Laythe. Music by Corey Cook. Funding provided by Erie Arts and Culture, and we appreciate you all for listening to Our Erie podcast. Peace.